Jon Bergeron here again. In our last talk, I discussed the stress that so many of us are experiencing, particularly in this past year. We talked about what stress is, how it impacts our bodies, and how it should be a reminder that this world is not our home, that our ultimate hope is not in what this life has to offer or what healing and improvement can happen in this life, but in what God has done for us, what He's doing in us presently, and ultimately what He will do for us when we join Him in heaven. So today I wanted to spend some time talking about how we can manage the stress that's part of life that we can't necessarily avoid. At this point, I'm guessing that each and every one of us is experiencing a significant amount of stress. In addition to the normal brokenness that we experience in life, we're coming up on a year dealing with a pandemic that has radically altered our daily lives. On top of this, we've seen an unprecedented amount of social, political unrest in this country. So what do we do about this stress? How do we manage it? How do we prevent it from turning into more serious mental health issues like anxiety disorders or depression, or from having a negative impact on our physical health? So what we do is we get better at managing our stress. We can't avoid it or get rid of it entirely because it's part of living in a broken world. But we can learn to respond to it better by managing it wisely. Most of you have probably heard or read about the idea of self-care, which has been a popular topic for probably at least the last decade, especially in psychology. Self-care encompasses all of the things that we do to care for and maintain our overall health, physical, psychological, and spiritual. And all of these things are ways in which we can better manage our stress. So when I first started hearing about this concept of self-care, as a Christian, my first reaction was that this sounds like being overly concerned about yourself and seems to move in the opposite direction that God's Word calls me in thinking of others more highly than myself and focusing on serving them and ultimately serving Him. And I do believe that without the corrective nature of God's Word, self-care can easily become a self-centered, selfish pursuit that does not honor God, but becomes obsessed with self. However, at the same time, there's a lot of wisdom in this concept that I believe is useful to us and honoring to God when properly applied. And I think a key element of that is this idea of managing stress in our lives. Now, to help, I think, have a proper focus in this arena, I think a much more appropriate title or name to give for this concept is self-stewardship. The idea of stewardship is a concept that the Bible teaches us to help us understand what our proper role and our responsibilities are before God. A steward is someone who is entrusted and responsible for managing someone else's property or resources. We see this concept laid out in the parable of talents in Matthew 25, where a master entrusts his financial resources, which are called talents, money, to 3 of his servants. 2 of them took that money and invested and doubled their profit. The third buried it with an explanation that he was afraid to lose the money because he knew that the master, reaped where he did not sow and was interested in expanding his resources. Now, the master was angry with this servant and called him wicked and lazy because he didn't invest and what he was given so that it could increase like the other 2. So in this parable, Jesus is making this analogy to God's desire for us to take what He's given us and invest it in a way that is profitable, not in the worldly economy of money and things, but in His eternal economy. So I would challenge us to recognize that ourselves, the self, is a resource that God has given us to make an eternal profit. And if we don't manage and care for ourself, that resource, we're not being good stewards. Our minds and bodies and hearts are God's gift to us that He wants us to steward and manage on His behalf, following His values. If we don't care for our bodies and our minds and our hearts, we are investing that resource poorly. We will diminish our ability to serve Him and love others if we don't take good care of that resource that is us, the whole self. So in the same way that I should invest the financial resources that God's given me in his kingdom, not for my own good, and I shouldn't be obsessed with money and getting more of it for myself, I should also care for myself as an investment for the kingdom, but not be obsessed with myself and my own well-being. So here's an example. When you travel on an airplane, the flight attendants explain what to do in a situation where the cabin pressure is lost and the oxygen mask dropped down from above. They explain that the proper way to steward this oxygen that you need to stay conscious and potentially alive when you're traveling with a child is by telling you that you're to put your mask on first and then help the child. At first, this might seem backward and selfish, but there's great wisdom in stewarding your own oxygen so that you can stay conscious and help the child, rather than doing the foolish thing of helping them first and risking passing out before they have their oxygen mask on. So similarly, we need to care for ourselves in a manner that allows us to fulfill God's calling to love those around us, not just today, but for our whole lives. So what does this self-stewardship entail? To manage stress and take good care of ourselves, we need to see ourselves in a holistic manner and pay attention to and care for all parts of ourselves. We're physical beings that are housed in a body that needs to be cared for. We're also psychological or mental beings with a mind that needs attention and care. We also exist in a social context of relationships that need to be stewarded and cared for. And we are certainly spiritual beings who can only thrive and serve God well if we're feeding and caring for our souls. So we're responsible to steward each of these areas in our lives. And by doing so, we honor God and are ready to serve God as he calls us to do so. It's helpful to go through each of these four areas and ask yourself maybe two main questions to assess how am I doing with this stewardship of myself. Number one, how am I stewarding this particular area in my life in an unwise or unhealthy way that I need to stop doing? And the second question would be, what things can I start doing that would better manage or steward myself in this area of my life? It might be helpful to grab a piece of paper and write these four areas that we discussed out and leave space in between, and then kind of answer these questions. What do I need to start doing and what do I need to stop doing to be a good steward that God's calling me to be? So let's talk a little bit about each of those areas. Let's start with stewarding my physical body. This is probably somewhat obvious, but many of us overlook this in the busyness of life, and particularly as we get stressed. But what I put into my body, my diet, the food, and even potentially the chemicals that I ingest can either do harm or can help keep my body healthy. And so part of good psychological health is I talk to a lot of people about, hey, what are you putting into your body? And so I would really encourage you to think about, man, am I taking care of my body well through what I feed it? Secondly, exercise is a huge part of keeping our bodies running well. And so if I'm not exercising, good stewardship would indicate that I need to move my body to help maintain it so that I'm ready to serve God in whatever way he might call me to serve. Another big one, probably less thought of than the first two, is sleep. It's also somewhat trickier because you can't just force yourself to sleep. But there are a lot of good practices that we call sleep hygiene that can really help us sleep, and there's a lot of bad habits that interfere with us sleeping. Particularly in this technological age, looking at screens late at night is one thing that disrupts our brain's ability to go through the natural process of falling asleep. And so these are just three areas, and there's others that I would, encourage you to consider. Man, am I stewarding this body that God gave me well? And one thing I would say about that as well is that it's not important whether I'm really happy with my body or unhappy with my body. Either way, God's given me this body and I'm called to manage it and steward it well, to invest it for the sake of the kingdom and not squander it by doing unhealthy things and avoiding the healthy things. So that's kind of a few things to think about in terms of stewarding our physical self. The second area I'd encourage you to think about is stewarding my mind and emotions, psychological health. One area to think about here would be, what are the thought patterns that I habitually fall into? One of the concepts we talk about in psychology is this idea of self-talk. We all have a running commentary in our head, and we tell ourselves certain things. We have a narrative for life that explains what's happening around us. And for some of us, that can be really unhealthy and create a lot of negative thinking, fear, anxiety, and other things. And so paying attention to what I'm telling myself, am I telling myself true things and helpful things, or am I telling myself untrue or damaging kinds of things? Secondly, and I'll talk about this in the spiritual health piece too, but the idea of meditation and prayer is actually a really important part of psychological health. That when we spend time pushing out the stressors and the anxieties of life and focusing on God's goodness and meditating on His Word, it does a lot of really good psychologically healthy things to keep my mind and my heart in a healthy place. Another thing to think about is just general brain stimulation. And just like our bodies, there's good things that we can stimulate our brain with, and there's also some real negative things. Video games, for instance, are really highly stimulating things for our brain, and in moderation are not necessarily a problem, but overuse can actually do a lot and actually lead to depression, anxiety, and even rage, and particularly in young people. Social media would be another one, is we're stimulating our mind through these things, but is it a good stimulation? Is it a good investment both of my time, but also in terms of what it does to my mind and how my brain works? The final area I'd like to throw out in terms of stewarding our minds and emotions, our psychological health, would be the idea of boundaries and learning to say no when that's appropriate. I think this is an absolutely core issue of stewardship, that as a steward, we are called to be stewards for the master, who is God, not other people. And in life, sometimes other people can put a lot of pressure on us to do things and want us to work in the ways that they want us to work, when our master is actually God. And if God is calling us to do something, we need to actually protect that and be faithful to what He's called us to do, even if that disappoints someone else. And this is where the idea of boundaries come up, the responsibility we have to say no to the things that God's not valuing, and yes to those things that He is. The next area I'd love to talk about is just stewarding our relationships. So I'll probably run through this fairly quickly, but just the idea of thinking about who God has given me in my life to invest in, both for their benefit, but also for my own. And we need to look at, how am I investing time in those relationships? Am I focusing on those relationships? Which is really an unknown or kind of forgotten aspect of love, is that to focus is one of the primary ways that I demonstrate that I love them, that I care about them, that they're important to me. And sometimes in relationships, maybe particularly in family relationships like marriage, sometimes it's helpful to ask for help, to talk with older, wiser believers, or people who've been down the road a little farther, or a counselor potentially, or a pastor, to get help when we get stuck in relationships or we fall into really unhealthy and bad patterns. So that's just some areas of stewarding relationships. The last area I talked about is just stewarding my spirit. So spiritual health. Am I feeding myself with God's Word? Am I praying and meditating? Do I gather together? And in this pandemic scenario we're living in, that's really hard. But there are ways to connect with each other, even if we can't do it in person. Using the electronics that God's allowed us to develop and use that for the sake of the kingdom, to meet with brothers and sisters and encourage them and be encouraged by them. Really important at this stage. And the idea of worship, I would say, is another huge one. And that's one thing that I think a lot of people have really struggled with not having as a more regular part of their life. But we can still worship both individually and corporately, even if we can't get together at times. So I just would encourage you to, again, maybe reflect on all four of those areas, maybe write out some ideas about ways that you can, improve your stewardship of these resources that God's given you, of your physical body, your mental space, your mind, your brain, relationships, like we talked about, and ultimately, finally, spiritual, your spiritual self, your spirit. So as we face stressors in life, we can manage those stressors by remembering that we are stewards of all that God has given us, including ourselves. And if we're intentional about making wise stewardship decisions in regards to our bodies, our minds, our relationships, our spirits, we will manage and cope with the stressful things in life that we don't have control over. Especially as we steward our spirits, we remind ourselves of the truths of God's love and sovereignty. And when we do that, the stressful things in life will diminish in their ability to cause that stress and that fear. So I hope that this concept of self-stewardship challenges you and me to be more purposeful in the choices that we make in life. And that it helps us to better manage and steward the stressful experiences that we have. So it's been great hanging with you a little bit. In my next talk, I'm going to spend some time talking about trauma, anxiety, and depression, what it is, and what we can do about it. And so I hope you can join me for that. God bless.